Hi, everyone. This is Linda Joy Myers, and I'm interviewing today Susanne Dunlap. Hi, Susanne. Welcome.
Hi, Linda Joy. I really am happy to be here.
We're going to talk about the story behind the story. This is the interview series that I'm doing now, and I can't wait to poke behind the curtain, you might say, and find out about your writing and how you create your masterpieces. I'll give you a little bit of introduction here, and we'll go on and you can add more. Susanne Dunlap is the author of more than a dozen historical novels for adults and teens, plus a series of novellas about the 18th century painter Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. Her love of historical fiction arose partly from her studies in music history at Yale University, and partly from her lifelong interest in women in the arts as a pianist and nonprofit performing arts executive. Her novel, The Paris Affair, won first place in the CIBA Dante Rossetti Awards for young adult fiction. You have been busy, Susanne.
Yes, I have, although I look busier than I actually have been because I have chosen in recent years to find ways to bring manuscripts that I had basically finished years ago and to bring them out. So it looks like I'm being so productive, but in fact, most of them
still wrote them, but you still. Yeah. I'm going to let you get away with that.
I know, but I mean, it spread out over my whole sort of publishing career from 2005 to 2023. It's, it's 13 books, I think. So
well, I'm in awe, let me tell you. I've just written my first historical fiction novel, as you know, The Forger of Marseille, and I'm working on how do I get to the one that comes after that. So I bow down to your creativity, and we're going to talk about creativity today. So among all those books, there's a new one coming out. So would you please tell us what it is and a little bit about what it's about and when we can get it?
Sure. It's called The Courtesan's Daughter, and it takes place in 1910 New York, sort of set against the backdrop of the early film industry and the sort of garment industry and various other bits and pieces. And it's a mother-daughter story, which is, it's interesting because there was a time when I sort of realized, as you might know from what you're reading, that in my books, the mothers are just absent. And mothers just don't exist. And I thought, what's that about? And so I kind of challenged myself to do something where the mother had a really big role to play. And this is actually, the courtesan is the mother with a sordid past, a French immigrant. And it's told in alternating first person points of view, the daughter and the mother. And so it was a really interesting challenge, and I hope it worked. So yeah.
Well, congratulations. I really look forward to reading it. I'm reading some of your other books right now. I'm trying to catch up. It'll take me a while to get through 13 books if I but I love
no need.
I know, but I love your writing. It's very natural and very easy to read, and you weave in things so beautifully. And I want to talk a little bit about some of what I'm noticing. But first, I'm going to ask you a question about historical fiction itself, because the purpose of these discussions that I'm having with authors is to sort of dig in deep into the kind of the role of historical fiction. What does it do for us? Why do we write it? Why do people read it? So how come that's your apparently the genre that you love?
Well, first, let me say I once tried to write contemporary fiction and fell flat on my face. I think that the thing is that I love history. I am fascinated by it, and it's for me, it's also taking myself away from the present, back into a past, into a sort of, it's a little bit of escapism, I think. And I think that's one of the reasons that people like to read it as well, because it's the worlds before this one always seemed simpler in some way, even though they probably weren't.
Yeah.
But it's also, for me, when I was a graduate student at Yale, my dissertation focused on things that were sort of feminist in slant, and so I'm always interested in women in the arts, because historically they have been somewhat overlooked or not admitted to the canon, so to speak.
Absolutely.
And so so that's sort of my underlying purpose. And the more I can do that, the better I feel. And there's lots of different ways of doing it, but for me, there always has to be some kind of artistic tie-in, whatever kind of art it is, music, art. I think I may be starting to work on something that involves the theater. But I don't know yet.
The muse is tapping on your shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's wonderful though. But I admire and also that we do need the stories of women in different eras and what were they doing. I mean, it took me a while to realize how conditioned I was to not realize that I was missing that. It was sort of like I took the male world for granted. That's just the way it was, through these years learning. Of course, that wasn't the case. And then, there were many, now we know many more than we've even been able to write about or know enough about women heroes, women heroines, women leaders. We know of a few, Cleopatra, and I don't know, but.
Well, and I have a theory about, and I think it's supported really, is that it's because of the Victorians that we don't know a lot about them. Because if you dig into the past a little more, they're there, not just because you dig into the past and unearth things, but because people were talking about them. They were important within their own settings. And the Victorians, starting with Rousseau in the 18th century, decided that a woman's place was in the home, and she was the angel of the house, and that's the only place that she could, so women weren't allowed to be creators. They could be recreators, they could sing, they could play the piano, etc. But acting, not so much, because that that crossed over into prostitution. But anything domestic was all right. And interestingly enough, the book you're reading, The Musician's Daughter, one of the things that made me want to make her a violinist is that the violin has historically been an instrument that women were not allowed to play, because of its association with the devil.
Oh my God.
And it's so women, there were some really wonderful violinists in the past who were women, but it was not, you could play the piano, you could play the harp.
Right.
Forget something like the cello, because you've got this thing between your legs.
Yes.
And you can't,
really
it's a very ungainly way to sit.
As a cellist, I can completely relate.
Right. Exactly. But so.
Well, that's really interesting. Well, and bringing up things I didn't realize it had to do with the devil. So that's something to learn more about the history of culture and the history of oppression, really, and how many different angles there actually are in that history. That you're
just one of the most famous virtuoso violin pieces is the Devil's Trill Sonata.
Oh,
and I think that's by Paganini. It's either Paganini or Locatelli, but I think it's Paganini.
I think it's Paganini.
And he actually did a lot to sort of enhance that image of the violin, of course. Ooh. So
there we are. Oh my gosh. Well, so how do I talked about the muse tapping your shoulder, but how do these ideas come to you? I mean, do you, for instance, do you already kind of have an idea in mind, or do you do some research and then an idea pops up, or all of the above? But Tell us more, please, about your process of creation.
Well, it's so it's so hard to encapsulate, but sometimes it's something that I stumble on in research. Sometimes it's just I go to a place and there's something evocative about it, and uh,
Mm.
or I hear about some historical event, or just I'm curious. I mean, right now I live in a very historic, in terms of the 18th and 19th centuries, mill town, and were the mill girls who were sent, from their homes to work in the textile mills. And this has been going through my mind, thinking there's got to be a story there somewhere. So I'm just kind of putting out the feelers, just letting it, reading, doing things like that, and seeing what comes up. The worst thing I can do is kind of force it into something.
Yeah.
But once I have the idea, I have to be very disciplined about how it comes together. So
Let's talk about that.
but I'm not there yet.
Okay.
Sorry.
So let's say for some of your other books, the usual question everybody gets is, are you an outliner or a pantser? I mean, obviously you're intuitively, you're sensitive and you've got feelers and you're intuitively exploring already, whatever it might be, all these books you've done, right? But then, okay, so let's say you go, okay, I'm going to do this one. Then what is your process at that point?
Well, first, let me say that my process has evolved over the years. I started out as a complete pantser. I mean, I would just sit there and think, and just start writing and see what came up, And sometimes I guess I have a sense, and I know it's the story is, my sense of how stories work is pretty good. So usually they come out okay, but maybe it's as I get older, I don't know. But I find now that I want to have a little bit more structure in place. I don't outline. I don't sit there and I'm not one of those people who needs to outline their whole book scene by scene before writing.
Okay.
But I'm a book coach, and when I did the training for that, I discovered some tools that, in fact, that's one of the reasons I did it, because as a pantser, when I saw the sort of tools there, I thought, oh my God, I could do that. Then that would help me. It's not deadening. It's not sort of whatever, but it's sort of a way of thinking about the book that just made logical sense, that wasn't something that locked you into something that you couldn't change. Mm-hmm. So I tend to put myself through what I put my clients through, and I'll tell you, it's hard.
Yeah, it is, but at least you can see some of the roadblocks coming before you hit them with your truck when you're writing, and you've got 200 pages and you go, oops.
Yeah, exactly. And that's happened to me. And even when you think you've got it laid out and you know what's going to happen, I don't care what anybody says. When you're writing, things just come up. Your characters suddenly start doing something you didn't think they would do. Suddenly a new character comes into the picture because, it's logical at that point. But then what I try to do is sort of go back into the foundation that I've set up, insert that character or that thing, and see how it affects what's coming after it before I actually try to write it on the page.
Sounds very helpful.
Yeah,
actually,
it is really helpful. Mm-hmm. But I'm probably like most coaches, doctors, whatever, I'm my worst patient. So
aren't we teachers that way? Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm learning, having written, pretty much The Forger of Marseille was intuitive. It was my first novel too, and I felt very confused after writing memoir. Okay, this is the reality. I know what happened. I was there, except for my second memoir, which goes into the history. But I put myself there in people that I knew deeply, that I'd known all my life. So I knew them, so I could go into their history and their minds and their imagination, But then it was like, well, how do you know what to make up? And how do you make these decisions? And so those were, kind of hard questions. For me, it's not that there's one way or one rule, but if you're not used to it, it almost felt like I was breaking rules. I just can make stuff up, so it was a
Yeah.
different world.
I mean, and especially when you're talking about historical fiction, I think that's what trips a lot of people up, because I always say fiction is the noun, historical is the adjective. So it's fiction first. That's why you're writing it. You're telling a story, and obviously you're not, unless you're writing alternative history, you're not going to change the big things that everybody knows about, like the date World War II started or something like that, or the really famous monarchs and that sort of thing. But you have to invent things, because as soon as you put any words into a historical figure's mouth, you're inventing something.
Yeah.
Because there's no record of them saying it. And if you tried to write something that was in, say, the mid 20th century and there were recordings, it would just be a disaster, because
real life is boring.
Yeah, and not just that, but history doesn't arrange itself neatly in a story arc.
Right.
And so you have to make decisions, you have to change things, you have to maybe nudge some less important dates around to fit, your narrative.
Right.
For instance, in The Courtesan's Daughter, one of the movies that I have being made at Vitagraph Studios was probably actually made in 1905, but I moved it to 1910 because I needed everything to happen in that year, and that was the year of a disastrous snowstorm, which plays a big role in my novel. So, if somebody really wanted to look it up, they could say, wait,
That's
but
wrong.
Does it matter?
Right. In terms of the plot and the book and the characters. No, I hear you completely. Yeah. So, well, I'm such an aficionado of history and my early coaches said, okay, but this is about your characters and you've got so much of this history you're putting in there. And I said, oh, but it's so interesting. It's like, oh my gosh, who knew?
The dreaded info dump.
Yes. That. And I plotted around history rather than characters for 2 years until I went, oh, maybe I'm a slow learner, but I went, oh, this is about these people. And
well, that is actually really important observation, because I think, except possibly for police procedurals or something like that all books are character driven. Because if the reader doesn't care what's happening to this character, doesn't actually want to be with this character, they're not going to read. I think even in a cozy mystery, you have to enjoy the sleuth, him or herself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though the book is following a certain pattern and that sort of thing. So it's all about the characters, and which is really what drew me to the system I was talking about. It's not a system, it's not a method, it's a tool, because it's totally focused on what makes sense for the character, what happens, and causally that relates to the character.
What leads to this, what leads to that, then what do they do to pick up the thread, and then what goes on after that, this sort of logical characterological progression. And having a background as a therapist helped me understand more about the psychology, almost too much. It was like I sort of went too deep sometimes, and so finding the right balance. But so do you find yourself, writing, or, how do you deal with the psychology of the characters you're developing, or their backstory, or their wounds, or whatever? I mean, how does that come up for you?
Well, I think you have to understand from the beginning the basic, simple character things. What do they want? What do they need? What happens if they get what they want? What happens if they don't? and what are the obstacles, what's in their mind that they believe that's getting in the way of doing of getting what they want, all that kind of stuff. And I'm not a psychologist, but I think putting yourself in there as much as possible and really within the character thinking, how would this affect me? Not just what would it make me do, but how does it make me feel in my heart? What's, is really important. And history is things that took place a long time ago. But I think basic human nature is the same as it always was. So,
Right.
there's going to be falling in love. There's going to be rivalries and all that sort of thing. And I imagine that within the context of their own settings, everyone probably reacted similarly to the way we would for whatever that version of that is in our present day.
Right. Yeah, no, that's really true. And, so I did that. So what was fun for me is learning how to writing from the point of view of two different male characters. Actually, I found it easier than writing from the point of view of the female character because it was a little too close and I had to find a way to make her herself and not much of me. I mean, yeah, some, but so there's all kinds of things we run into.
It's so interesting you talk about that because I remember the first time I had in many of my books, I have male POV characters, and I'm always anxious about it because I don't know what it feels like to be in a man's body, in a man's mind. And I think, is this going to be okay? And then I get things saying, oh, your male character was really great. I'm like, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's like we're not good judges of our own writing or whatever. Yeah.
And I think it's normal to have things where we go, okay, we have doubts as writers, and you're quite an experienced author and you've been published a lot, but it helps. I think it helps the rest of us to know that you go through that, you go through your own or whatever.
Oh, yes. Because, once you've been published, then there are the reviews and you're biting your nails over those, and then the readers and all that sort of thing. And it's just, there are so many ways to feel rejected as a writer. And it's really hard to keep sort of, not faith exactly is what I mean, but keep yourself positive about it. And for me, that the best thing to do is just to be deeply engrossed in writing another story and being very, in the zone, so to speak.
That's what I was thinking. The best antidote to all that is to get into the next story, which and I'll be doing too. But well, it is very inspiring for me to talk with you and to find out more about how you think about it. The fact that you two also have these doubts despite all the years that you've been writing and all the books that you've published. And I think that it's so relatable among all writers, historical fiction and any fiction writer or any writer, but particularly fiction is what we're focusing on today. And I'm really looking at the significance of what historical fiction books do, which is bring us into a world that we otherwise wouldn't know much about and learn about history as it's alive, not just flat there in a history book.
Yes, and that's very much, I think, what motivates a lot of historical novelists is you want to make it real. You want to really have a reader feel what it's like, what it might have been like at the time or whatever, and to just not to have this boring history account of what happened and that, although there's some wonderful nonfiction writers of history. I think of David McCullough or somebody like that, and Antonia Fraser. Those they really,
but they
it's
make
wonderful,
stories.
But it's a different thing.
But they make stories.
Exactly. They make stories, but they keep it. They don't have to make the whole arc the way a novel is. The novel has a very specific need in terms of form and trajectory.
Yes. Well, thank you so very much. We're going to sign off now, and I hope to talk to you again soon about other upcoming things, and really, really welcome the birth of your novel. When is Courtesan's Daughter going to be out?
It's the 25th of April, so a week from tomorrow.
Oh, a birthday.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
And and it's so funny because book launches are really kind of non-events, but I'm having a party. So, yeah.
Oh, well, good. You should have a party, and we'll celebrate with you. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording now, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.